They laughed at him when he decided to sleep in the snow cave. But when the storm hit and every other shelter was buried, his decision became the only choice for survival. In the frozen wilderness, ingenuity and desperation collide in a fight against nature's most brutal force. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if you're moved by the incredible ingenuity of frontier survival, hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The air in the valley had begun to change, growing heavier with the scent of an impending storm. Tobias Reynolds, a solitary trapper far from any established settlements, stood at the edge of his makeshift camp. His thick fur coat, lined with the pelts of beavers and muskrats he'd trapped, was a shield against the growing cold. He had built his cabin with his own hands, though he hadn't anticipated the brutality of a storm like this. Tobias watched the sky, darkening with snow, clouds and the wind picking up, carrying fine grains of ice that stung his face. He felt the weight of the wilderness closing in, and something deep inside him recognized the storm would be fierce, possibly lethal. The thought of retreating into the cabin crossed his mind, but there was no guarantee it would offer protection. The cabin was solid, yes, but in these conditions, nothing was certain. The storm was coming with a violence that could tear apart the best of shelters. And so, Tobias made his decision. He had always trusted in his own resourcefulness. This was a man who had survived in the harshest of conditions. As the first heavy snowflakes began to fall, he moved to the nearby hillside, scouting for a new shelter. There, nestled against the earth, he found the snow cave he'd once dug on a whim. It wasn't much to look at, a hollowed-out space in the snow, reinforced with branches and rocks to keep it stable. It looked vulnerable, a mere temporary respite in the wilds. But something about it drew him in, the sense that the snow could serve as a natural insulator, a refuge in the worst of storms. His breath puffed in front of him as he knelt at the entrance, measuring the cave's size, its depth. If he could make it through the night, the storm could pass over, and the cabin would still be standing. He built the entrance a little larger, reinforced the snow walls, and pulled out the last of his firewood to make a small fire inside. The storm was coming quickly, and the snow cave was already beginning to feel like his best option. As Tobias stepped inside, he tried to ignore the doubts creeping in. His instincts told him this would be an unforgettable night, one that could either save his life or condemn him to nature's mercy. He pushed the thought aside. There was nothing left to do now but wait. By midnight, the storm was in full force. Wind howled through the trees, bending them low, as if nature itself were trying to break free. Snow fell in thick sheets, blurring the world outside. The fire inside the cave crackled softly, its warmth doing little to stave off the relentless cold creeping through the snow walls. Tobias kept adding small sticks to the fire, hoping the snow wouldn't begin to melt and collapse the fragile structure he had created. The wind was deafening now, and Tobias could hear the familiar, unnerving sound of the storm ripping through the forest. A low, guttural growl filled the air, the wind twisting around the mountainsides like an animal in pain. He reached for his coat, pulling it tighter around his shoulders. He knew that if he had stayed in the cabin, it would be no better. The building would eventually cave under the weight of the snow, or the roof would give way to the howling winds. It would only be a matter of time before the wind would destroy the very structure that was supposed to protect him. This cave, for all its imperfections, held firm. As the hours dragged on, Tobias could feel the weight of the storm pressing in on him. The cave's walls shifted with the wind, but they held. He had chosen well. The cold was biting, gnawing at his bones, but his fire kept the chill from creeping into the very core of his body. The snow cave was more than just a shelter, now it was a sanctuary. By the time the first light of dawn broke through the storm clouds, Tobias was exhausted. The wind hadn't let up. If anything, it had grown worse. But as he peered out from his icy refuge, a wave of relief washed over him. His decision had been right. The snow cave was still standing, untouched by the fury outside. The cabin, however, was nowhere to be seen, buried under the heavy snow. The storm had claimed it, just as Tobias had feared. He took a deep breath, the cold air sharp in his lungs. He would survive this storm, and from now on, he would never doubt the wisdom of nature. Even in the harshest of conditions, there was always a way. Sometimes it just took a different kind of thinking. The snow cave had become his salvation. The storm raged through the following days, leaving Tobias alone in the wilderness with only the snow cave and his fire for company. With the wind howling outside and the snow piling up higher than he could have anticipated, the landscape was almost unrecognizable. The forest was no longer a patchwork of trees and open spaces, but a blanketed sea of white, stretching endlessly in all directions. Tobias had always been self-reliant, but this was different. He was alone, cut off from the world, and entirely at the mercy of the storm. He had not expected to be trapped for so long. His initial plan had been to wait out the worst of the weather and then return to his cabin. But as the days passed, the storm only grew more violent, and his hope of leaving seemed to dwindle with each hour that passed. The fire in the snow cave had become his most valuable asset. He gathered any scrap of wood he could find, carefully tending the flames as they crackled in the center of the hollow. The warmth it provided was essential to his survival, yet Tobias knew he couldn't rely on it forever. He needed to ration his supplies, make them last as long as possible, and hope that anyone would pass through the area before the storm claimed everything. As he sat near the fire, Tobias thought back to the past. He had been a trapper for many years, spending months on end in the wilderness. He had faced countless challenges, but nothing had ever tested him like this storm. There was no mountain to climb, no animal to hunt, only the unrelenting fury of the elements. The days blurred into one another, and the only marker of time was the dwindling supply of food and firewood. Each day, he ventured outside to gather more supplies, but the storm made it increasingly difficult. The snow was deep and heavy, the wind bitter and punishing. His hands, stiff from the cold, could barely grip the tools he needed to gather firewood. Each time he made it back to the cave, he felt more exhausted, more disoriented. Yet, the thought of the cabin once his safe haven buried beneath the weight of the snow was a constant reminder that this was not the time to grow complacent. Tobias continued to test the limits of his endurance. He rationed his food, eating only small portions, and avoided unnecessary movement, knowing the energy he had left could be better spent elsewhere. Every now and then the wind would die down, offering him a fleeting moment of calm. But it was always short-lived. The storm would soon pick up again, stronger than before. On the fourth day, Tobias noticed something peculiar. The walls of the snow cave had started to shift. The snow was compacting around him, and he could hear the crunch of it settling as the weight above him grew. He knew that he couldn't let the walls collapse. If the cave was buried by the snow, his survival would become a matter of luck, not preparation. He sprang into action, reinforcing the walls with branches and rocks, packing the snow as tightly as he could around the edges to prevent it from giving way. As he worked, Tobias began to realize something. The snow cave was his lifeline, his testament to ingenuity and will, but it was also a reminder of his vulnerability. Even with all his preparation, he was still at the mercy of the storm. The weight of the snow outside was relentless. It felt as though the world were pressing down on him, threatening to smother him with its sheer force. Tobias glanced at the entrance to the cave, his eyes narrowing against the falling snow. If he could keep the walls intact, if he could maintain the fire, he might survive this storm. But for how much longer? With each passing day, the battle against the elements grew more dire. The storm had gone silent for a brief moment when Tobias ventured outside to check on the surrounding area. The stillness was unnerving. The air was thick with the weight of the snow, and the forest that had once seemed so alive was now eerily quiet. It was a strange, unnatural calm, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Tobias stood at the edge of his snow cave, staring out into the vast expanse of white. He could see the distant outlines of trees, their branches heavy with snow, sagging under the weight. The mountains, usually so imposing and clear, were hidden behind a curtain of swirling white mist. The world had shrunk to a place of isolation and fragility. He took a deep breath, his exhale clouding in the cold air. The snowstorm had slowed, but it was far from over. It would start up again soon. Tobias knew he couldn't let his guard down. His fire was still burning strong, but it needed constant attention. He turned back toward the snow cave, but before he could move, something caught his eye. A set of tracks, large, distinct, and unmistakable, appeared in the snow. They were fresh, the edges sharp against the white backdrop. Tobias's heart raced. He knelt down to inspect them. Grizzly bear tracks, The beast had been near, perhaps even circling the cave, seeking shelter from the storm. His thoughts rushed. What if the bear had found the entrance to the cave? What if it tried to dig its way in? Tobias's mind raced with possibilities. He had heard of grizzlies seeking shelter in the snow during winter storms, but this was different. The storm had driven all animals into hiding, yet this one had braved the bitter cold to move through the mountains. It was a creature driven by instinct, survival, and hunger. Tobias slowly stood, his hand brushing the hilt of his rifle. He had heard nothing, no growls, no heavy footfalls. The tracks alone were enough to make him uneasy. The bear was out there, somewhere in the storm, and Tobias had to make sure his shelter was secure. He rushed back to the snow cave, ensuring the entrance was firmly blocked. He added more logs and branches to reinforce the opening, but something gnawed at him, a feeling of being watched. He couldn't shake the thought that the bear was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for an opportunity. Tobias settled inside, pulling his furs tightly around him as he stared into the crackling fire. The storm was still silent, but he knew it wouldn't stay that way. The bear might return, and he wasn't sure how much longer the snow cave would hold. The odds of surviving in these conditions were slim, and yet he refused to yield to the wilderness. As the wind began to howl again, Tobias allowed himself a brief moment of hope. He had made it this far. Against all odds, he had found warmth in the coldest of places, and as long as the storm kept raging, he would fight for his life. He was determined to survive. The wind howled like a wild animal as Tobias lay inside the snow cave, his eyes flickering between the fire and the small entrance he'd carefully reinforced. It had been 3 days since he'd first spotted the bear tracks, but the creature had not returned until now. The storm was as relentless as ever, and Tobias had assumed the worst of the weather had already passed. But the night had proven otherwise. It started with a subtle shift in the air. A change in the wind's direction, a slight rustling outside, just faint enough to make Tobias sit up and listen. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. He knew the bear was close. The tracks he had discovered earlier were a clear warning, but now, Tobias was starting to believe the bear was more than just curious, it was hunting. His instincts screamed that the creature was near, and the realization tightened his chest. The cave was his sanctuary, but it was far from invulnerable. Tobias was trapped here, isolated in the heart of a storm, with nothing but the snow and a fire for protection. Tobias rose from the warmth of the fire, his breath misting in the cold air. His rifle, leaning against the far wall of the cave, was a lifeline, but it would do him no good if the bear got too close. The thought of engaging in a deadly fight with a grizzly in this kind of environment made his stomach twist, but it was the only option. Creeping toward the entrance, Tobias knelt and peered through a small opening he had left in the snow barrier. The world outside was a blur of white, the storm still battering the landscape, but there, at the edge of the trees, he saw the unmistakable silhouette of a grizzly. Its massive form moved slowly through the snow, its dark fur blending with the shadows of the storm. Tobias's heart pounded in his chest as the bear stopped, lifting its head and sniffing the air. The grizzly had sensed something. Tobias had to move fast. He quickly pulled back from the entrance, sealing the small gap with more snow and branches. The bear had not yet discovered the cave, but Tobias knew it would not be long before it began searching for food or shelter. If the bear became persistent, it would test the entrance and the walls. His mind raced as he grabbed his rifle and checked the firewood pile, ensuring the blaze remained strong. He needed to keep the warmth alive. It was his only defense against the cold. But the real danger was outside, waiting, and Tobias could not afford to panic. He had to remain calm. His survival depended on it. Hours passed, the storm still fierce, and the wind seemed to push the bear's scent further into the valley. Tobias's nerves were fraying. The bear would return. It was only a matter of time. His only chance was to outlast it and hope the storm would drive it away, just as it had driven him to the snow cave in the first place. But deep in his gut, Tobias knew that the wilderness did not offer second chances. And this bear was testing him. The storm continued to rage outside, its fury growing ever stronger, yet Tobias remained locked in a tense silence inside the cave. He had not heard the bear since its first appearance that morning, but the pressure was mounting. He couldn't help but feel as if the creature was lurking just beyond the reach of his sight, waiting, watching. The snow cave had been his sanctuary, but now it felt like a prison. Every small creak of the snow around him, every slight shift in the air made him jump. Time stretched endlessly in the cave as Tobias sat by the fire, watching the flames dance and flicker in the dim light. His food was running low, and every day the firewood supply shrank. He had just enough to keep the fire going for another day, maybe two, but he was fast running out of options. The mental toll was beginning to wear on him. He had always been a man who could survive by sheer force of will, but this storm was a challenge unlike any he had faced before. The cold was not only physically numbing but emotionally draining as well. There was a part of him that wanted to give in, to let the storm take him. But then he remembered the bear, the fierce reminder that the wilderness had no mercy. No, Tobias wouldn't give up. He couldn't. Not yet. With a deep breath, he stood, stretching his stiff limbs. His joints ached, his body weary from the isolation. He moved cautiously to the entrance of the cave, kneeling and pushing aside some of the snow that had drifted in. He needed to see if the bear had left. There was no point in hiding if the threat had passed. For the first time in days, the air outside felt slightly calmer, though the wind still whipped the snow in all directions. Through the haze, he spotted the bear's tracks again. It had moved deeper into the forest, but the tracks were fresh, indicating the bear was still close. Tobias's heart thudded in his chest as he ducked back into the cave, closing the entrance with more branches. He had survived another night, but he wasn't out of danger yet. The bear was close, and with the storm showing no signs of relenting, it could return at any moment. The days blurred together as Tobias continued to tend the fire and wait. There was little else he could do. His shelter was strong, but it wouldn't hold forever. The storm would eventually let up, and when it did, Tobias would have to decide whether to remain or try his luck with the outside world. For now, though, survival was his only concern. As Tobias sat by the fire, staring into the flickering flames, he couldn't help but think back to his life before the storm, before the isolation and the danger. He had always been a man who valued his independence, who had learned the hard way that survival was never guaranteed. But this storm, this brutal fight against nature, had taught him something he hadn't expected. It wasn't just the strength of the body that allowed a man to survive, it was the strength of the mind. In that moment, Tobias understood that survival wasn't about fighting nature, it was about learning to endure. And endure he would, no matter the cost. The storm had been relentless for over a week now, and Tobias had long since lost track of the days. The world outside had become a frozen, snow-covered wasteland. Nothing moved beyond the walls of his snow cave, no animals, no other trappers. The storm had driven everything into hiding, yet the most dangerous creature of all was still out there, the bear. Tobias had not seen it since that first encounter, but the tracks had remained, a constant reminder that the beast was close, always close. He knew it wouldn't be long before it returned. The bear had been hunting, looking for food, and if it couldn't find its natural prey, it would find him. Every time he ventured out of the cave, he did so with caution, stepping carefully to avoid leaving signs of his own presence. But the food supply in the cave was running low, and Tobias knew he couldn't survive much longer without replenishing it. He had to risk it. He needed to find more food. The cold was cutting through his bones as he stepped out into the storm once more, the wind howling fiercely around him. His eyes squinted against the swirling snow, and he could barely make out the trees in front of him. The bear's tracks were still visible, but they seemed to fade into the white abyss, lost in the snowdrifts. He'd followed the tracks for hours, with only the dull crack of ice beneath his boots to keep him company. Suddenly, the crunch of snow echoed in the distance. Tobias froze, his pulse quickening. The wind had shifted, carrying with it a faint scent the bear was close. A shadow moved in the corner of his vision. He turned slowly, his breath catching in his throat. There, not 20 yards away, the grizzly stood, its massive frame almost blending into the snowstorm. Tobias's hand instinctively reached for his rifle, but the bear was already aware of his presence. The grizzly's eyes locked onto him with an intelligence that sent a cold shiver down his spine. It was no longer just hunting, it was stalking. The bear had found him. With every muscle tensed, Tobias slowly raised his rifle, the weight of the weapon in his hands both a comfort and a curse. He had one shot, one chance. The bear was a few steps away, and Tobias felt time slowing. Every breath he took was drawn in sharply, the air bitter against his skin. He aimed, taking careful measure. The storm's wind howled, pushing against him, but Tobias remained steady, his focus narrowing onto the bear's chest. The bear's massive head lowered slightly, as if in preparation to charge. Then, in one fluid motion, Tobias pulled the trigger. The gunshot rang out, a sharp crack in the silence of the wilderness. The bear roared in pain, its body jerking back as it took a step toward Tobias, then collapsed to the snow with a thundering crash. Tobias stood frozen for a moment, staring at the fallen creature. The snowstorm had silenced the world again. He could hear nothing but his heartbeat pounding in his ears. The bear was down, but Tobias knew the danger wasn't over. The storm still raged, and he wasn't out of the wilderness yet. The weight of survival pressed heavily on him as he turned and began the long trek back to the snow cave. The battle was won for now, but he knew the storm, the wilderness, and the grizzly had tested him in ways he hadn't fully understood until that moment. Tobias didn't know how long he had been walking when he finally saw the entrance to his snow cave through the swirling snowflakes. His legs felt like lead, the exhaustion from the long trek and the encounter with the bear wearing him down. But there was a sense of relief, too. The cave, his fragile sanctuary, was still standing, still offering protection against the storm. He staggered inside, collapsing next to the fire, his breath shallow from the cold. The bear's body was still fresh in his mind, and the adrenaline was slowly draining away, leaving him with a profound sense of weariness. The storm had not subsided. Outside, the world continued to rage, but here, in the quiet warmth of the cave, Tobias allowed himself a moment to reflect. He had survived barely. But as the days stretched on, he realized that survival in the wilderness wasn't just about finding shelter or food. It was about resilience, about pushing through when every instinct screamed to quit. As Tobias sat by the fire, feeding it with what little wood he had left, he reflected on the past weeks. He had been tested in every way imaginable. He had faced hunger, cold, and the constant threat of the bear. But in those moments of silence, when the storm seemed to press in from all sides, he had found something deeper than survival. He had found a quiet strength, a will to endure. He didn't know when the storm would end. It could last for days more. But for now, he was safe. The fire burned steadily, its flickering light casting long shadows on the walls of the cave. Tobias pulled his coat tighter around himself and leaned back against the snow-packed walls, feeling heat seep into his bones. In the calm that followed, Tobias closed his eyes and allowed himself a brief respite. He knew that his journey wasn't over, that the wilderness still held dangers he couldn't even imagine. But for now, he had conquered the storm, and in doing so, had proven that even in the harshest of conditions, a man could survive if he had the will to do so. As the storm continued to rage outside, Tobias let his thoughts drift. He had made it this far, and for the first time in what felt like weeks, Tobias Reynolds felt a flicker of hope. The wind had finally begun to die down, the howling gusts that had battered the snow cave for days, now a distant echo. Outside, the storm's fury had subsided, leaving behind a vast, snow-covered landscape that shimmered in the pale light of the morning. The world had transformed from a chaotic, wind-swept wilderness to a serene, frozen expanse. Tobias stepped cautiously out of the cave, the fresh powder crunching beneath his boots. The air was still biting, but the worst of the storm had passed. The sun, hidden behind thick clouds, cast a soft light over the snow. It was a deceptive calm, peaceful on the surface, but underneath, the wilderness was still dangerous, unforgiving. He stood for a moment, taking it all in the silent white world stretching before him, the remnants of the storm hanging in the trees like thick, glittering frost. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Tobias allowed himself a moment to breathe. His heart slowed, the tension in his muscles easing. The bear, still lying where he had shot it, was the first thing he noticed. It had not moved, its lifeless body stark against the snow. Tobias had killed it, and yet the victory felt hollow. The bear had tested him, but he had survived. The wilderness had thrown everything it had at him, and yet he was still standing. He felt no triumph in the kill. Survival was never about victory, it was about endurance. The bear was just another reminder of the constant struggle between man and nature, a fight that would never end. Tobias had won this round, but he knew that there would always be more storms, more challenges. Tobias gathered what little strength he had left and began to haul the bear's body back to the snow cave. It would provide food for the coming days, but more importantly, it was a symbol of his tenacity. Even in the face of overwhelming odds, he had not yielded. He returned to the cave, setting the carcass aside. The fire still burned, and with a final push, Tobias prepared the bear's meat. He had survived, and that was enough. For now. Weeks passed before Tobias finally ventured out from the cave, the storm's remnants still lingering in the air, but no longer holding him captive. The wilderness had reclaimed its sense of quiet, and the world outside had returned to its brutal, unyielding normal. The snow cave, though small and temporary, had become a sanctuary. It had saved him, offering refuge against the storm, the cold, and the bears that roamed these parts. But more than that, it had shown him the kind of man he was. A man who, when pushed to the edge of survival, could endure. With the bear now fully processed, Tobias felt the weight of his isolation lift ever so slightly. His thoughts turned toward the journey ahead. The mountain man way of life was drawing to a close. The fur trade was dying, and with it, the old ways. The wilderness that had once offered freedom was becoming increasingly unforgiving. And yet, Tobias had learned to adapt, to survive. As he packed his meager belongings, Tobias realized something vital. Survival wasn't about defeating nature, nor was it about conquering the wild. It was about coexisting with it, understanding it, and respecting the dangers it posed. In the face of the storm, he had learned that it was not enough to rely on one's own strength. It was the ability to adapt, to keep moving forward even when every instinct told him to turn back, that made the difference. Tobias left the cave one last time, heading toward the distant horizon. There would be more storms, more challenges, but he knew he was no longer afraid of them. He had weathered the worst, and now he carried the lessons of the wilderness within him. His journey wasn't over, but he was ready for whatever came next. The wilderness would continue to change, but Tobias had become part of it.